Hello, in this video we examine two women writers of the Harlem Renaissance, Jessie Redmon Fauset and Dorothy West. Jessie Redmon Fauset was born in 1882 in New Jersey. Her father was a minister, and she graduated with honors from Philadelphia's High School for Girls in 1900 as the only African American student. At first she applied to Bryn Mawr, but rather than accepting her as a student, the college helped her to obtain financial aid to attend Cornell. At Cornell, she studied classical languages and was elected to the Honor Society, the Phi Beta Kappa. In fact, she is the first African American to be accepted into that honor society. After she graduated from Cornell, she taught for a few years in Washington, D.C., and then in Baltimore. But in 1919, W.E.B. Du Bois asked Fauset to move to New York City to accept the position of a literary editor of the magazine The Crisis, which was the official magazine of the NAACP. Also during this time, she received a M.A. from the University of Pennsylvania, and then later in 1929 got a certificate from the Sorbonne. Fauset is most remembered for her work at The Crisis as an editor. She published the works of Harlem Renaissance writers such as Countee Cullen and Langston Hughes, and garnered the nickname, quote, the midwife of the Harlem Renaissance. In addition to editing the magazine, she did contribute some of her own essays and poetry and short stories. In 1920 and 1921, she was also editor of the NAACP's magazine for children called The Brownies Book. Interestingly, much and not surprisingly, much of the credit for her work as an editor at The Crisis and even with the Brownies Book was given to W.E.B. Du Bois. Unfortunately, during her time as an editor, she received only a small amount of recognition. Now, though, she is recognized and remembered for her success as a writer, an editor, and even as a translator. She died in 1961 in Philadelphia. Our next writer, Dorothy West, also came from a solidly middle-class background. She was the daughter of an ex-slave who had become a successful Boston businessman, and really achieved success as a very young child. She published her first short story in the Boston Post when I believe she was 9 or 10, and then submitted a short story to the Opportunities magazine. They had a competition and won. Her story, The Typewriter, which we are reading, was published in 1926. And it garnered her a lot of attention. She later went on herself to found her own magazine called The Challenge, and this magazine brought focus on the great talent of the Harlem Renaissance. The talented writers such as Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, Richard Wright, and Zora Neale Hurston were all published in The Challenge. Eventually, though, the magazine failed, and she became involved with some theatrical works, including beginning work on a movie and then doing her own acting in Porgy and Bess. Eventually, when these projects also came to an end, she participated in the Federal Writers Project until it ended in the mid-1940s. Dorothy West lived a very long life. She died in her 90s, and she lived from the 1940s on Martha's Vineyard. She called it the home of her heart. She lived with her mother and her aunt, and she said that she really wanted to live there to escape the noise and distractions of the city, primarily Boston and New York. Some people have said that's also because it was less expensive to live on Martha's Vineyard. Her summer cottage was not really outfitted for year-round living, and she wrote somewhat humorously of dealing with frozen water pipes and other inconveniences. Her autobiographical novel, The Living is Easy, was published in the late 1940s. However, it got a chilly reception, and Dorothy West dropped off the radar much in the way that Zora Neale Hurston did. But then in 1982, she was rediscovered again in the way that Zora Neale Hurston was by feminist scholars. And the book was republished, and she garnered a lot of attention. As a result of that, she began a series of tours at colleges and really became well known. Her book, The Wedding, her novel, The Wedding, was then published in, I believe it was 1995, and it's set in Oaks Bluff and Martha's Vineyard, and deals with the aspirations of the East Coast black elite, those who owned summer houses in places such as Oak Bluffs on Martha's Vineyard. And that was made into a PBS made-for-TV movie. Interestingly, critics have compared West, her narrative style, to the Russian author Dostoevsky. Like Dostoevsky, critics have pointed out that she probes deeply into the minds of her characters, those people that are facing moral crisis, social confinement, and those type of issues. So I hope you enjoy the short stories by both of these women that we are reading this week.